There we go. And there's John.
Good evening. Today on Saturday Evening Talks, we're welcoming Robin and Terry from Fridays at Fettermans to talk about what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, when they're doing it, and finding out more about their journey. Welcome. Robin, please tell your story.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you. So I'm Robin Lasserson. I'm here with my partner in marriage and business and organizing, Terry Rumsey, and we are the co-founders and co-coordinators of Fridays at Fettermans, which is a weekly witness against the war in Gaza in front of the office of U.S. Senator John Fetterman at 200 Chestnut Street. And I'll turn it to you to introduce yourself and maybe tell a little bit about how the vigil got started, and then we can hear what other questions you have for us.
I'm Terry Rumsey. I'm living in Old City in Philadelphia, and the story of Friday at Fetterman's really begins in 2022 when Robin and I both volunteered for the Fetterman campaign and gave what for us was a significant amount of money, and were celebratory when Senator Fetterman beat Mr. Oz there, became our Pennsylvania senator. So after October 7th, we were shocked by his very war hawk stance on Israel and kind of expressing that he thought they had just a right to basically do whatever means were necessary in Gaza. And we went to a demonstration that was organized by the American Friends Service Committee in front of Fetterman's office on November 13th, and it was good. A couple hundred people went. And when we asked our friends at AFSC if they were planning to make it an ongoing protest, they said no. It was a part of a national action, and it was a one and done kind of thing. And since we are living just 2 blocks north on Church Street, we thought we could be the anchors for an ongoing presence in front of Fetterman's office. And so we began Fridays at Fetterman's, a weekly Friday vigil, and it's been 50 consecutive weeks since that first one that we've been out there. Sometimes there's a handful of people in the freezing cold. Sometimes we had as many as 200. Usually it's 25, 35, as many as 50 people on a Friday. But we naively believed that Senator Fetterman, who had a history of being an advocate for human rights and anti-racism, could be persuaded if he would meet with folks from the peace movement, at least to moderate and lighten his views. It turned out not to be the case. We also were naive that we were kind of confident that the United States would leverage a ceasefire early on in the process, given that how much they give aid to Israel. We figured there was a corresponding influence, which again did not prove to be true, which is why we're still needing to be out there. And that's the overall story of how we got started. We worked really hard to engage Senator Fetterman. We sent a delegation to Washington to meet with his top foreign policy staffer. And later we'll tell a story that myself and 3 other folks from Fridays at Fetterman had a dramatic meeting with him in the garden of the Senate Russell office building, which was beamed over 1 million people through social media. But that's the essence of the story.
Yeah, so I mean, originally the focus was on Fetterman and the idea that we could persuade or pressure him. We did all the kind of like traditional lobbying tactics in addition to the weekly vigil. We had people calling him and writing him, and as Terry said, were very persistent in pursuing a meeting with him and got this meeting with his aide. And, she was she was a good listener. She seemed sympathetic to the concerns that we were raising. She sort of was signaling maybe that she was even on our side, and expressed that it had been very challenging, to be dealing with this issue and handling the level of emotion that people were bringing to it, especially people with close connections in Palestine. And she vowed she was going to get us that meeting with Senator Fetterman. And in the end, she could not. And so at that point, they had kind of slammed the door, and we decided we needed to culminate that first phase of the vigil with a symbolic act of resistance. And we organized coordinated civil disobedience actions simultaneously at his Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. offices, and it was called Seeds for Peace. And we actually collected 30-some thousand watermelon seeds, the watermelon being a symbol of Palestine, to try to deliver to Senator Fetterman in his Philadelphia office. And so some of us ended up staging a sit-in in the foyer of the Custom House building there in Philadelphia, and simultaneously a delegation that included Terry and 3 other folks went to DC, and you can tell what happened there.
Yeah. Just acknowledging that John Webb was one of the individuals sitting in Fetterman's Philadelphia office lobby.
Thank you. Yes, John and I were
was
busted
arrested,
together.
so
Yeah.
thank you, John. I went to Washington, D.C. with 2 Presbyterian ministers and a Mennonite, and we walked into Senator Fetterman's office and sat down at his table, announced we weren't leaving until he supported a immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And his staff was very nice. We had a good time. Folks came in and out all day long. They let us sit there. A delegation from Code Pink came, and we were singing songs together, and other peace activists were lobbying in the Capitol. It was an intense time. It was April of 2024, and by that time, about 5,000 folks had been killed. Of course, there's so many more now, but at any rate, Fetterman went walking down the hall by his office, looked in and waved an Israeli flag at us as a kind of a taunt. And we discussed it and decided that we should follow him and see if we could have an exchange with him, which we had been trying to get with him since we started the vigil. And so we went out, and there was a supporter there, a Arab American, who had a phone, and he started videotaping it. And Reverend Ashley Rossi, a Presbyterian minister, actually went up to him. And by this time, he was in the garden of the Russell Senate building, which is enclosed and locked off from the public, but we were able to access it. And he sat down on a bench, and the others of us came and joined, and had about a 20-minute meeting, which was captured on video, in which he basically ignored our questions and simply repeated, "I stand with Israel. I'm with Israel."
What about the hostages?
What about the hostages? And we tried to explain we cared about the hostages, that at that point, the only hostages who had been freed through negotiations with Hamas in an exchange of prisoners, and that the war was not producing the release of hostages. And he would say, "I'm with Israel. I'm with the hostages." And it was shocking that he wasn't truly willing or able to engage in a dialogue with us. And as I said, this particular video happened to go viral and over 1 million people watched it, and many people were concerned about his rigidity and maybe questioning somewhat if the stroke that he had had was limiting his ability to have a positive, a fruitful exchange with his constituents. And in fairness to him, he didn't have his device that translates when people speak so he can read it, but we offered to let his aide go get it, and he did not want her to do that. So we did have a meeting with Fetterman, and ultimately we got the message. He was inflexible and was not going to move. And we had a real discussion about stopping the vigil at that point, Susanna, Sandy, and John, but decided it should go on not just to target Fetterman, but as a symbol of opposition and resistance to the war in Gaza and the occupation of Palestine. And so 50 weeks have gone by. We'll be vigiling this coming Friday, and that is the basic story of Fridays at Fetterman's, with a lot of other good tales in between, but that's the broad picture.
Well, and I would just sort of raise up that one of the reasons we decided to continue to hold the vigil despite sort of the impasse with Fetterman was that kind of a community was forming around the vigil, and a set of people who felt like the vigil had created a space for them to express their dissent and sort of allow their conscience to be driving them, and that the tone that had been struck there was one that lifted up both an explicit commitment to nonviolence and a commitment to justice for all people in the region, and that felt really valuable to the individual people who were coming on a regular basis. And so we were reluctant to put that down because it was serving a need within the peace community, and we felt that by doing it, it also allowed us a platform to interact with allies in the movement, including, if not now, the Progressive Jewish Organization that's working for peace and justice in Israel-Palestine, and the Prayers for Peace Alliance, which is a partnership between Jewish Americans and Palestinian Americans working for peace and justice, and other activists of all stripes. And so sort of in between the Friday vigils, we were interacting and supporting each other's events, and sometimes holding events not on Fridays. And, we can talk more about that.
Susanna, could I make one last segment of the story? Because something really dramatic happened in my life. And right after that civil disobedience that we talked about, and where I met with Fetterman, and John and Robin and others met with the federal police in Philadelphia. I started having severe pain when walking and got very alarmed and went to the doctor and found out that I might need to have surgery, heart surgery. It turns out that I had a stenting procedure. I won't get into the medical jargon there. I know you understand it, Susanna, but so we had to step away for an indefinite period of time. And Sam Khattab, who's the Palestinian American Christian, who's a co-founder of Prayers for Peace Alliance, came up with the brilliant idea that other organizations in the movement could each take a Friday and do what Robin and I had been doing as the co-coordinators. And people like John Webb and others really stepped up. The vigil continued despite the fact that we were no longer able to be the organizers. And that went on for like 5 weeks. I had a successful procedure. I'm feeling better than I did beforehand. And we came back, that we were invited back to resume our roles as co-coordinators, and it has a happy ending. But really, the peace community beyond Terry and Robin made a decision. They too wanted Fridays at Fettermans, and that really strengthened our community and strengthened the vigil. So that's it on Fridays at Fettermans. I think people get a pretty good view.
Yeah, I'd like to say how important it is for me as someone who was just absolutely, it's like my world, it's like the floor fell out on October 8th, the day after the massacres. When Netanyahu explained that he was going to starve and bomb and kill everyone he could in Gaza, and that was just so. I was looking for communities, and I was in Puerto Rico, and when I came back to Philadelphia in October of 2023, there was a massive rally at City Hall, and it didn't make the news. I mean, there had to be 5,000 people who marched.
We were at some of them.
Yeah, massive numbers of people from Jewish Voices for Peace, and it wasn't even mentioned. And that was just horrifying. And then I went back to Puerto Rico, and then there was a huge rally on May 1st after that young man burned himself to death, the young serviceman. We marched through San Juan, and after that I started going to the weekly rallies of Madres contra la Guerra, which has the same focus that you have too. I mean, they're peacemakers. The peacemaking came from Quaker communities, although Dr. Sonia, the founder of Madres contra la Guerra, is not a Quaker. She was influenced by Quakers when she was working and studying in Berkeley, in California.
Right.
And I like the fact that, of course, all peacemakers are not Quakers, but I like the fact that so many peacemaking organizations have come from Quakers. Now, so for me, essentially, these weekly rallies are keeping me sane. It's as simple as that, because I'm still just as horrified as I was on October 8th. And having a place to go once a week where people think the same way you do and are just as horrified. It's like I'm not insane. It really is horrific. But if you read the newspapers, it's so that's that it's a safe place, and that's just wonderful. So I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and
Thank you for sharing that. It's important.
It's obviously taking a toll on you two as well, and you're continuing. And thank you so much for that. I'd like to change direction, and well, the question is always, why do you care? I mean that, and you told me early on off record, your life story and how you came to it. But maybe you can summarize it. Why do you care? Maybe Robin, you can start.
I mean, I don't remember a time when I didn't care about peace, really. I mean, I think from early on, I was explaining to Susanna before we started the formal part of the meeting that I'm a birthright Quaker, born into Swarthmore Friends meeting, and that's because my mother grew up in Swarthmore, and her parents, who had been Presbyterians, were convinced Friends who moved to Swarthmore to work at the college. And I grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and we were attenders for a period of years in my childhood at Cleveland Friends meeting, where I went to first day school. So I was sort of exposed to Quaker values, although neither of my parents really were very devout Quakers, I'll have to say. I grew up maybe in what could be accurately described as a liberal, secular, humanist household informed by Quaker values, and returned to Quakerism myself my senior year in high school, and then as a first-year student at Swarthmore College. I ended up coming back to the community where my mother had was raised to go to Swarthmore, and that my experience at Swarthmore was like a very highly politicizing one, and I was hungry to learn about the world and to learn how to prevent war and bring justice. And that is actually where I met Terry within the first 2 weeks, I think, of when I arrived on campus in the fall of 1984. He was running a voter registration project in Chester, which is just a couple of miles from Swarthmore. And I had quickly learned that Chester, was this very poor sort of post-industrial Black city. And I just sort of intuitively understood, like, if poor people vote, then we win. And Ronald Reagan was up for re-election. And I naively thought I could influence that situation. But so I dove headfirst into registering voters, but kind of like just went to every kind of event that I could. And at that time, what was kind of the predominant issue that got my attention on campus was Central America solidarity work and U.S. military intervention in El Salvador and Honduras and Nicaragua. And so I started learning about that, and that, just kind of opened up whole worlds for me that led to that caring about people in other parts of the world and the role of my government in oppressing people and killing them for political and economic purposes so that war profiteers could make money hand over fist. And that was kind of the beginning of my activism. And we can touch on this, but as a result of getting to know Terry and other activists on campus and off campus in that period, it launched a lifetime of joint political activism and community organizing that has been very enriching. And I consider it to be, my rent for living on the planet. And so, we've organized over the years around a lot of different issues. First around voter registration and voter empowerment, removing barriers to voter participation. And then that organization morphed into a chapter of a group called Jobs with Peace. It was a chapter of a national organization whose mission was to redirect federal budget priorities away from military spending and into human services and social, rebuilding cities. And we organized a coalition that included poor and working people in Chester, as well as unhoused people, along with suburban peace activists, to work together on that. And that led us into the area of like organizing around homelessness and affordable housing. And then there was the first Gulf War, which we touched upon earlier. And in there was some Central America solidarity work. And then, a lot of anti-death penalty work over the years, some environmental activism, particularly in our hometown of Media, where we recently moved from. And a lot of organizing during the, after 9/11, during the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. We had founded an organization called Delaware County Wage, Peace, and Justice, and we were co-coordinators of the Delaware County Peace Center for a period of time and organized an annual peace festival. And so, we have kind of gone where we felt there were openings or possibilities for change, even though, a lot of the causes have seemed large and difficult to wrap your head around and hard within one lifetime to see a lot of results. We've met so many amazing and inspiring people like George Lakey and Michael Gagne and other friends and non-friends alike. Sam Kitab. I mean, just every movement has these people who have this light of determination and hope within them that feeds me, that helps me continue to care and kind of rise up again after periods of fatigue to say, damn it, not gonna stay silent. And so for me, sort of like the motivation is like comes at three levels. And one is just like to live with my own conscience, like to be able to sleep at night, to know that like I am doing something, that I'm not sitting back and letting atrocities occur with my tax dollars or in my name. And that gives me some peace. And then the second layer is the communities of solidarity that rise up around these kinds of organizing around issues. And that interconnectedness and the sense that I could be contributing, even in a small way, to people living more meaningful lives is really rewarding to me. And then the third level, of course, is the idea that like ultimately hoping to have some impact. And sometimes I feel like I've gotten to see the fruits of the work and sometimes not. And I've come to accept that, we don't always know the immediate impact that we're having, but I know enough from studying history and the history of movements to know that, when you're that deep in it, you can't always zoom out. Like it's not possible in our human existence to get the perspective that we always need over time, or just the knowledge of a more objective look at it to see what effect we're having. But I have a belief that we're links on a chain and that it all contributes to positive change. And we might backslide as a society and then we'll make gains, and it's endlessly dynamic. But for my time on the planet, I just feel like it would be a withholding of my gifts as an individual to not contribute in some sense to a struggle for peace and justice.
Wow. I will say, Susanna, I've met a lot of wonderful community organizers in my 50 years of activism, but I've never met a more brilliant organizer than the woman sitting next to me right now.
Thank you, dear.
Why do you care, Terry? And you told me before that it all started in Chester, and I'd love you to talk about the journey from Chester, why you care, and if you can talk about Tom Tarosian in the middle, that would be fantastic too.
It's a big part of the story. Yeah, I was born and raised in Chester, which is the poorest city of its size in the entire United States. It was a shipbuilding town in the World War II, and those jobs all went to Japan and Korea and then elsewhere. And the Chester riverfront, which had been a mighty industrial job producing and product producing machine, just fell apart. White folks fled the city. I grew up in the last white neighborhood in Chester. At time of the civil rights movement in the 60s, there were marches coming through our neighborhood. And, my mom was a single mom. My dad died when I was 2. I had 2 older sisters and 2 older brothers, and it was tough for her. She basically lived off the check she got from the federal government because they actually took care of veterans' families after World War II, unlike what we've devolved to through all the wars Robin mentioned. But yeah, I was a troublemaking kid in a town that produced a lot of troublemakers and drove my poor mother a little crazy. And I was a rebel without political focus. And when I was 16, I walked into the Chester Friends meeting with a friend of mine. We were skipping Catholic Mass. I've been raised in Catholic school. but we were kind of rebelling, which was our nature. And we walked into a Quaker meeting and we were totally perplexed about why these folks were just sitting saying nothing. It is not what we did at Catholic Mass. And afterwards, they came up to us and they were so nice, and it began a lifelong relationship with Quakers. I didn't join, but I did start attending, and they opened up their doors of Chester Friends meeting to the neighborhood young people. And we started with their guidance to do positive things like start community gardens and try to clean up our park that bordered the Friends meeting, and also to oppose the Vietnam War, which I was kind of leading that aspect of it. And, I do attribute Gene Lester and the other Quakers from Chester Friends meeting at that time to helping me transform my rebellious nature that was getting me in trouble with the police in one way, into other avenues of rebellion, which ended up getting me in trouble with police in a more positive way and a nonviolent way, and a way that was conscious. And, I'm not going to get into all the troublemaking that I did in Chester, but there was a white political machine that had dominated Chester since the Civil War. It was Republican in a majority Black city, which was unthinkable in the 1970s and 80s. It was, Chester was frequently the subject of national articles and television programs. How can it be so backward? You have to understand, Chester was extremely isolated. It was before the internet, there was television, but I was meeting folks who had never left the city ever. Not even to go to Philadelphia, which was only 20 miles away. And it was like a plantation run by a very vicious, for its early stage, Republican white machine. Then it became very good at just using patronage and power to control the city. They deliberately discouraged voter registration in Black neighborhoods. And that's when I decided my political organizing career started with some other folks. We organized something called Project Vote, which stood for Voter Organization Training and Education. And we registered 15,000 people, which Robin Lasserson probably did about 5,000 of them. Swarthmore College students came down, but we organized Chester folks and feminists and peace activists. We used voter registration as a vehicle. And I got very involved in Chester politics. I worked on local school issues and other issues. And today, Chester, 85% of the town is registered to vote. I'm very proud of that. I was part of the national voter registration movement of the 1980s, and so was Robin, which Barack Obama also ended up working for National Project Vote, who we linked up with. So that's my claim to fame. I worked in the same movement as Barack, and that movement helped elect him ultimately. We really broke through it. At that time, like 35% of the Black community was registered to vote, and now they have the highest voter registration.
Talk about Tom Tarosian.
Tom Tarosian came into my life because that's where he was the pastor of Chester Eastside Ministries, a white Presbyterian congregation that fled the city during that time I talked about of white flight. And it sat there for a long time, this unbelievably beautiful building, church. And Tom was appointed to be the minister and ministry leader of a community-based church. And I guess he came there in the mid-'80s, just when we were doing all this voter registration. And in 1991, Tom and I and his wife Pat, who's now a member of Arch Street Friends Meeting. That time she was a member of the Presbyterian Church, and Robin, lots of other good folks, created a movement that overthrew that white political machine that had been in power since 1865, and we elected a Black Democratic woman mayor, the first ever in Chester, and took control of the council. And Pat Trojan was actually the campaign manager of the Democratic Party campaign while Robin and I did the nonpartisan side, getting folks to register. So Tom Trojan, who was an amazing civil rights leader in Washington, D.C. before he came to Chester, also was a force for changing Chester along with Pat. And the Trojans are our dear friends, and Tom has passed away, but he hasn't passed away in my heart.
And Chester Eastside Ministries is where we were married.
It is. Robin and I were married at Chester and Eastside Ministries with a wonderful combination of peace activists and unhoused people and neighborhood people and little kids running through our wedding. And it was a wonderful day. And Pat and Tom were there. It was a Quaker style wedding. Tom kind of was the facilitator, but it was a beautiful day. And so Chester's was really where I started community organizing. As Robin said, I won't repeat. We went on to partner in working against gun violence, working for environmental justice, working against all the wars, which the United States keeps you busy with, opposing wars. At least during my lifetime, they seem to come one after the other. And now we are committed to changing U.S. policy on Israel, which is fueling just an unimaginable, war crime on Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon. We need to stop sending weapons to Israel. We need to become a force for peace in the Middle East instead of the bankrolling the war that's happening there. And that's our new cause. And we are so grateful that everyone here at this meeting is a part of it. And we believe that going forward, so much good has happened over the past year trying to stop the thing that is so bad. I mean, Philadelphia's literally had tens of thousands of people march, write letter, go to city council meeting, go meet with their senators and Congress people. Fridays at Fettermans is just this little small stream, a little rivulet that's flowing into the river of Philadelphia, which is flowing into the ocean of international movement. And so we feel we're part of something bigger, but we have to get smarter. We have to get more organized, and we have to get more strategic. So that's movement 2.0 in our opinion. But that's the Chester story, Susanna. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, that was great. Pete Seeger, I can remember him saying, well, the day before the Berlin Wall fell, no one knew it was going to. And that's
Thing to remember.
You just keep on going, and suddenly, something will change.
Nelson Mandela said it's always impossible until it's done.
Okay, so Pete Seeger was probably quoting Nelson Mandela then.
Well, I think they had on the same wavelength, maybe.
They had the same. Sandy and John, I'd love to hear your questions.
Well, my question is, where are you hoping to go from here with the new administration coming in.
Well, we've thought about Canada, but we decided we're going to stick around. But obviously, I mean, it was shocking, depressing. I could come up with probably a string of about 50 negative words about it. But it changes everything. And it was going to be hard enough to change U.S. policy towards Israel under a Harris administration, because we know that the Biden administration was either ineffectual or complicit, but could not stop the war crimes, even though we have the leverage, because we've sent over $18 billion to Israel for guns, tanks, bombs, and bullets since October 7th. But Trump is an ally of the fascists who control Israel, and they're delighted that fascists control the United States. And he has basically said, you have a blank check as far as we're concerned. There's not going to be, however pathetic the Biden administration was saying, now don't you do that. And then when they did it, saying, well, don't you do the next thing. And then when they did that, but don't you do the next thing. I compared it to a parents of a kid who keeps wrecking the car and getting DUIs and saying, you have to stop. Here are the keys. Now you be good this time, and but Trump is going to be actively complicit, Sandra. So I think it is about building a durable resistance movement here in the United States that continues the demand that we can't have a racist policy. We have to want Jews and Palestinians to prosper in that, and what some call the Holy Land, that we have to stop military aid. I don't want to give military aid to Hamas, and we should not be giving it to Likud. They're just as much a terrorist organization. They're two terrorist organizations, and we should be peacemakers, not fueling the war. And Fridays at Fetterman is going to be a force to say Jews and Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, Quakers, Buddhists, Hindus, we need to bring together all our forces. We don't all have to be under one umbrella, but we have to communicate with each other better. We have to have a better job at figuring out how we're approaching the Philadelphia Congressional District. Delegation, not district, thank you. And we need to figure out how we challenge Lockheed Martin and the weapons makers who are sending the weapons of mass destruction. So we all have a lot of work to do, both talking to each other and, it's a challenge to have Trump in there. It is. I would just be lying if I said, it's the same, Harris, Trump, not. But he would like us to quit in despair. And I'm not going to give him that satisfaction. We're not quitting.
I'd like to say one more thing to your credit. As a result of my doing my little spiel that day, it really gave me my voice. And I just did an hour-long interview with Mark Helps Me. Mark?
I have heard of Mark.
I met him at FGC this summer, interviewing Jonathan Katab. And we got into talking, and he wanted me to do an interview, and it took me a long time to say yes. But then as a result of doing the Fridays at Fetterman, I felt like I had a voice. So I just taped an hour-long interview with him, and it's supposed to come out next week. Mark Mark started a radio under the care of his meeting in Wisconsin, in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. It was successful. That was 15 years ago. It was successful, and it's now syndicated all over the country. I think there are like 34 stations that have picked him up. So he's interviewed a lot of people. He's interviewed George. He's interviewed Katab. He's interviewed Steve Chase. I mean, he's interviewed a lot of people in our world. So I'll keep you posted.
That's wonderful.
But I got my voice that day at your
See, if
vigil.
you don't know what seeds we're sowing, I mean, that's what I was saying about, like, you don't always know the impact, like the ripple effect that your actions, such as that interview, might have on somebody who's listening. Because I wouldn't have guessed that that was a launching off point for you in that way. So I think it's, somewhat the faith that if you put the energy out there, it's going to have this ripple effect, and you can measure it later if you're lucky.
Yeah. So thank you. I came tonight in respect and in awe of what you're doing.
Well, you gave a great talk that day,
Yeah, it was
Sandy,
wonderful.
on a very important Jewish holiday. So,
Yeah. Joan, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was actually, I've had conversations with Robin about more of a deeper analysis of the sociology of these movements. And she talked about just now about how sometimes you don't know, if you're going to win or how you're doing because you're so deep into it. Could you expand on that, Robin, a little bit and talk about how you see maybe this developing based on your studies, your understanding of these movements?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I would prefer to defer to Michael Gagne at our How Movements Win workshop, because he's such a more skilled and committed scholar than I am, for sure. And so I think that I was speaking from a personal observation that, particularly when you try to tackle like national or global issues, and you really are just this tiny little like droplet in an ocean of effort, seldom can you point to a specific victory. Although, I mean, I think I can safely say that, I think that the movements we were involved in the mid 80s stopped a US invasion of Nicaragua. Like, I do think that the Reagan administration intended to invade Nicaragua, and that our movement made it so controversial that became impossible. Like, can you prove that? Maybe historians, can make an argument, but that's one where I thought, like, okay, like I contributed, and it was hard to tell. It didn't seem like it was going that great. And certainly a lot of bad things happened in US policy in Central America, but that was one thing where I thought, like, there was some success. But then other times, we were active in the gun violence movement for 5 years after the Sandy Hook massacre. And that movement really gained some momentum in that period and built in it for a moment, like for a hot second, it seemed like maybe some minor reform was possible. And there have been some local victories that you can point to, but mostly what you can point to is the infrastructure of the movement grew stronger, and that ultimately, like, it's a generationally long struggle. And, obviously, like, you choose the Israel-Palestine conflict, my God, like, of all the issues that you could take on, it is like notoriously like the most thorny and complex and intransigent, and so I think in this instance in particular, it might be difficult to say like that, like winning in terms of like a dramatic change in US policy toward Israel is possible. But I think some of our work professionally, and we don't maybe have time to touch on that because I see it's 8 o'clock now, but we've done a lot of kind of organizational development consulting in the nonprofit world. And what I see is some things that you can measure is like, how strong is the infrastructure of the organizations that are doing the work? Are they prepared to pass it on to the next generation of leaders? are they flexible enough to work in coalition with other partners? And sometimes what you can measure is the strength of the movement. And then later you can measure like, well, did you choose incremental goals, that you can point to, yes or no? Like, did the legislation pass? Did you persuade, a politician who was resistant to you or neutral to take a position? And that choosing incremental intermediate goals is a good way to try to measure progress, rather than like, oh, did we get peace in the Middle East? Like, if you think about it that way, you can just drive yourself insane. But if you can choose strategic goals and focus on, are you building for power, both socially and politically, then it's a little bit easier to measure your impact. But different people come at this in different ways, and some people approach it from a much more spiritual perspective of like, this is really just about like the meaning that I'm making for my life and the impact that I'm having on other people. And like, for me, that's not sufficient, but it's not irrelevant either. And I don't know if that answers your
No, that's good.
thoughts. Change your mind.
The Nobel laureate, Dr. Professor Honorable Wangari Maathai, who was the first PhD in biology from Africa, well, certainly from Kenya. She always said, be a hummingbird. And a hummingbird, just going back and forth, getting a tiny drop of water to put out a forest fire. It's just a lovely image. Yeah. I'd like you to talk briefly about the work that you've been doing on Green Seeds grants, because this is part of your activism work. Can you talk about that briefly? You have a lovely website, greenseedsgrants.
Greenseedsgrants.com. Yeah.
Greenseedsgrants.com. And I read it, and it's the thing that jumped out at me was that you got a testimonial from Sister Helen Pregine, which was absolutely delightful. So if you can just briefly talk about your work there.
Yeah. In 2006, Robin was teaching at the school in Rose Valley, and I was working as the director of grants management for the Mental Health Association of Southeastern Pennsylvania, which is a peer-oriented mental health group that are now called Mental Health Partners. But I went out on my own and started the business of Green Seeds with the mission of helping to put money into the hands of people who wanted to heal the world. So Green Seeds is a company, while it is for profit, it only works with nonprofits. And since 2006, Robin has been a part of the business from the beginning, is now a full-time, actually probably doing more work than I am as I move towards semi-retirement. But since 2006, we've raised about $50 million for various causes, from very small grassroots groups that don't even have boards to multi-million-dollar big social service agencies. We prefer to work for social justice and advocacy groups, but in order to put the tofu on the table, we do often work with human service agencies who are more capable of paying to put that tofu on the table. But I know Sister Helen Pregine because I did fundraising for a group called Witness to Innocence, which was an organization of people who had been innocent on death row and were exonerated and returned to the community. And I helped create a national organization where they came together to both speak out against the death penalty, but also to support themselves. Shockingly enough, many times they would be released from prison and not get a dime and be basically thrown on the street after, 21 years on death row where their lives were stolen from them. So Sister Halen was actually the founder of Witness to Innocence. So I had the great honor of becoming her friend and comrade in the anti-death penalty movement. And it's one of the enriching relationships of my life. So yeah, we do grant writing, and we also do organizational development to help nonprofits think through the many challenges of trying to put something together, often founded by a creative, charismatic person in the beginning who has a wonderful idea. And then if it's lucky, the organization takes root and they have to overthrow their founder and build something that is truly community-based. And sometimes the founders stay, but we've just worked with many great people. I'll give one example. I work with a small peer, what they call peer-run mental health organization in DeWitt, Iowa, called Life Connections Peer Recovery Services. And these are folks who themselves were in psychiatric institutions or caught for many years in psychiatric services, got better, and are helping other peers share their pathway. And it turns out that scientific studies have shown that while it's not peer support versus psychiatric professional help, if peer support is not involved, people don't get well as quickly or as often. So I'm really proud to work with this group that runs a respite center for people who are having psychiatric crisis and a wellness center where you can just walk in any day and play games and have groups and meet friends and get your life together after a psychiatric crisis. You want to give an example of one of your clients?
Yeah, well, and first I would just say I was a teacher for 19 years at a beautiful little progressive school called the School in Rose Valley in Delaware County, and that's like a whole other meeting. But the grant writing business allows us the kind of freedom and flexibility to work from home, to do the volunteer activism with more freedom, and to have right livelihood, like to feel like we're earning a good living, but by helping groups that are doing good work. And you guys might be particularly interested and maybe already aware of one of my main clients, which is Historic Fairhill. It's a 4.5 acre historic Quaker burial ground in the Fairhill neighborhood of North Philadelphia, which is a very, very distressed neighborhood. And it was restored as a green space 30 years ago by Quakers in partnership with people living in the neighborhood. And they have formed a nonprofit that is partnering with 4 public schools in Fairhill to provide school library services and other direct literacy support to classrooms and students, as well as kind of activating that burial ground, which is now certified as a level 1 arboretum, as essentially an outdoor community center for the neighborhood. So they're holding, wellness fairs and seasonal festivals and educational events and an internship program for teens, and taking this resource that is both historically fascinating because it's where Lucretia Mott and Robert Purvis are interred, like all of these amazing abolitionists and suffragists, but then also activating it as a community garden and as a green space and as a place, like a safe place for children and families to come and to recreate in shade and in beauty in an otherwise blighted and very depressed neighborhood. So it's my great honor to write grants and raise the money that pays their staff and keeps these programs going, along with the many hundreds of individual donors who contribute every year.
And we have several other clients too, but they're just 2 examples.
Yeah, we we had a talk on the Sunday evening talks from people from Fairhill. So when I
Oh,
post
wonderful.
this, I'll put the link to that. That's great. It's interesting how everything is so interconnected, which is great.
Yeah.
Their board president, who is a Quaker, often comes to the Fridays at Fetterman's Vigil.
Yeah.
Sally
Harrison.
Yeah.
Harrison. Yes.
She's okay. Okay, I'm putting things together. Well,
A lot of connections.
A lot of-
thank you so much for talking with us and letting us get to know you. Is there anything you'd like to say before we turn off the
There
record?
is. We'd like to do brief commercials for two big events that are coming up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, now John heard this announcement today, the rise of meeting, but yeah, how movements win, that doesn't help to show a backward flyer on Zoom. This is the
But that
workshop that we're
works.
holding
It's not back
with
there.
Michael Gagne. And I'll put the link to our website in the chat, but this is the workshop. It's 1 to 5 on Sunday, December 1st, and it will be, it's not a strategic planning session for the Israel-Palestine movement, but it is a skills building and kind of like analysis workshop on what does it take for movements to be successful, especially under, authoritarian regimes, which is what, we're facing. And so we've got about 50 people registered to come. There's room for more, and we think it will lay a nice groundwork for strategic planning that takes place within Fridays at Fettermans and within the larger peace and justice movement for the Middle East going forward.
Yes, and Michael's going to give particular attention to some examples of movements who felt that they were losing and pretty much were at the end of the line, who went on to win. And I gave an example of this at one of our vigils, that in 1850, the slavery abolitionist movement in the United States was so depressed after the Congress strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, and they thought, we'll never end slavery in the United States. And 15 years later, it was, at least in legal form, gone. So you never know when you're winning and losing, but you can follow history to be strategic. And then on a few days later, on Friday, December the 6th, Fridays at Fetterman is marking our 1-year anniversary. We'll have been through 52 consecutive Fridays out on Chestnut Street, and we're marking the beginning of our next, hopefully not as long, because we're going to end the war, but we'll be commemorating our resilience and resistance to Israel's US-funded war on Palestine. And just a few speakers. Medea Benjamin, who is the co-founder of Code Pink, will be the keynote speaker. And she's an amazing activist who has been recognized as really one of the mover and shakers in the peace movement on a national level. In terms of Quakers, Citizen George Lakey will be speaking that day, and Lewis Webb Jr., who's the director of peace building for the American Friends Service Committee, will be, among other really great speakers. And a beautiful young woman named Allie Halpert, beautiful in her soul and spirit and her music, will perform a song at the vigil. And then afterwards, we're inviting everyone back for a community lunch and mini concert with Allie Halpert at the neighborhood house at Christ Church, just 2 blocks north of Chestnut Street on American Street, Church and American. And we hope that everyone who happens to listen to this will look at that website, and you can register from it. Where our goal is to have at least 100 people. We usually, like we said, have 25 or 30 at the vigil. We already have nearly that many registered. So we hope to go even above and beyond 100, but please, we invite, I know Susanna's going to be in Puerto Rico with the movement there, but we're hoping everyone who happens to listen to this will come out on December the 6th.
Okay, now the website again.
I put it in the chat. It's not an easy one to just say verbally, and I know that won't come through on the recording, but it's Fridays-Fettermans.mailchimpsites.com. Sorry that we don't have an easier website to share, but they could also email Terry at greenseedsgrants.com, Terry with a Y, greenseedsgrants.com for all the information.
And the wonder of Google, if you just type in Fridays at Fettermans, you'll get there.
It should come up. Yep.
Okay, so that's for the December 1st workshop, which is at Friends Center, 1 o'clock till
Yep.
4 o'clock.
5.
1 till 5, so it's a 4-hour workshop at Friends Center, which is on Market Street. No, not Market Street, 15th
15th and Cherry, 1501 Cherries.
15th and Cherry. And then Fridays at Fetterman's on December 6th. But
Yeah,
it's
noon.
noon.
200 Chestnuts.
Noon. Okay.
And there's a lunch afterwards that folks
Okay.
are welcome to.
Well, thank you very much. It was delightful having you here. I will now turn off the recording. Thank you so much.
Thank you.